Become a sustaining member of the Commonwealth Club for just $10 a month. Join today.
Hello and good afternoon. I'm Dina Temple-Raston. I'm a senior correspondent at a new news service called The Record by Recorded Future. And we're building what we hope will be the Bloomberg of cyber and intelligence news. But you may recognize me actually from my prior job. For the past 15 years, I've been a correspondent at NPR, working on terrorism, cyber, and recently investigations. And I've spoken at the Commonwealth Club in the past, but today I'm going to be your moderator. And I'd like to welcome the club members to this event. Tomorrow, as we're all very aware, is the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. And rather than look back, our panel today is going to look forward and talk about what they see as the key threats that we face today, 20 years after 9/11. Our panel was put together to view these threats through a number of different lenses. So there's Secretary Napolitano. She was Secretary of Homeland Security, first woman to hold that office. She's a former governor of Arizona, former president of the University of California, and now a professor of public policy and director of the Center for Security and Politics at Berkeley, which forces me to say, go Golden Bears. Sorry, Amy. Amy Zegart is a professor of political economy at of Business and a senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, and an author of an upcoming book called Spies, Lies, and Algorithms. And last but not at all least, Anthony Romero, the executive director of the ACLU and the author of, among other things, a book called In Defense of Our America, which took a look at civil liberties post 9/11. So just one housekeeping matter before we get started. If you have a question for our panel today, please use the YouTube chat feature, say that fast. You can ask questions there and we'll have someone who'll sort of curate those and send those questions to me and I'll ask them of the panelists. We'll try to get to as many of those as we can. So with that, let's dive in. And I was going to start with you, Secretary Napolitano. So 9/11 made us harden soft targets. We changed aviation security, but these new risks that we're facing now seem a little harder to protect against. I'm thinking of things like domestic extremism, misinformation on social media. What do you think we can do to address them?
Well, I think we have to be very agile and we have to be very proactive. We need to develop better ways to predict and prevent when individuals are moving from thought and belief to actual action or violence. And we also need to think about risk more broadly. For example, there are a number of risks related to climate change. And as we've seen that expressed this summer in wildfire and hurricane. And I think that also goes to the safety and security of the American people. And finally, new technologies, both cyber, biotechnologies, all kinds of new technologies, which can be used for good, but can also be misused for bad. So there's a lot of preventive work, proactive work that needs to be done.
Right, but it's a lot more than just having to, find a way to lock the door of the cockpit on an airplane. It seems
that's correct. And the risk environment changes. It's not static. It's always moving. And so, the challenge is to stay ahead of it to the greatest extent possible.
Right. So, Amy, let's talk a little bit more about that. We've been watching the polarization of the American public develop right before our eyes. Technology platforms have been stoking those fires. At the record, we've been talking about this idea that the internet used to reflect the world, and increasingly we're seeing it the other way around, that the world is reflecting the internet. And one of the things I mean by that is like what happened on January 6th at the Capitol. What do we do about that?
Well, I think, Dina, first, it's great to be with you. It's great to be with my panelists. It's great to be at the Commonwealth Club. And I'm so glad we're looking forward as well as backward to look at the threat landscape of today. Let me answer your question by picking up on a thread that Secretary Napolitano talked about, which is, we're in a very different world today. After 9/11, there was a lot of talk about whole of government. So DHS was stood up to really facilitate whole of government approaches. But now with cyber threats, misinformation, polarization, we need whole of society approaches. So one of the critical differences is the role of the private sector. So we know, the private sector owns and operates 85% of that critical infrastructure, much of it exceptionally vulnerable to cyber attack. But we also see these internet companies like Facebook and Google. They're not just victims of cyber attacks, they're vectors of cyber attacks. And so they're policymakers. So we need an expansive definition of policymakers today, not just people with security clearances in Washington, but people in these tech companies who are now have to share in that responsibility of protecting the country. And that's difficult because they answer to global shareholders, not American voters.
So when the executive order came out, I want to say in the spring, and it seemed to be bringing a lot more of the private sector into the tent. Do you feel like that's going to be a solution, or is this just going to be more of the same? We've been trying to get the private sector into the tent for some time.
Well, yes, and public-private partnership is a phrase people love to say, but often doesn't mean very much. It's got to mean more. So cybersecurity basic protections, like we saw with Colonial Pipeline, they can't be voluntary standards anymore. There has to be a much higher bar for organizations that are so critical to the safety and security of our country to get their cyber hygiene in order. So I think if we look at, again, looking back and looking forward, if we look at the organization of our federal government and our society on September 10th, 2001, it was nowhere near where it needed to be when it became. I think we see the same thing with cyber. This is a September 10th moment for cyber in the United States. We are not organized. We are not equipped in the way that we need to be to defend and respond to cyber attacks.
Interesting. So Anthony, let's talk about January 6th for just a second, because in a way that's so inextricably linked to social media and cyber and the internet. So there have been about 700 people who were arrested for playing some sort of role in the January 6th attacks. And only about several dozen cases have actually been resolved in some way. And the march of justice has been very glacial, which we'll talk again about when we talk about. And I think because justice is a domestic threat. Do you think there should be a domestic terrorism statute?
No. So let me just, that's the short answer. I can go on. Let me
Please
also
do.
join Professor Ziegard and Secretary Napolitano and you, and thanking the Commonwealth Club for hosting us. And it's not the same club I visited years ago, and when I came last there to talk about a very similar issue, I think it might have been the 10th anniversary. So here I am at the 20th, but it's great to be in such great company with great minds. And no, we have been very adamant that what government needs is not a new domestic terrorism statute. That what it needs, we have sufficient law enforcement powers, statutes, criminal statutes, by which to try the insurrectionists from the attack on the Capitol. I think I will cite Secretary Napolitano because I think I believe in giving people credit, but when we were talking prior to this session, she made a point that was really instructive to me. On 9/11, we were worried about individuals who took an airplane and were trying to drive it into the Capitol. And it was the ordinary citizens on the plane that stopped it from happening and were able to divert the plane into Pennsylvania. I'm giving you full credit, but it's a great line, Secretary. So I think, copy is the greatest form of flattery. And here you have, 20 some odd years later, and you have actually the citizens who actually attacked the Capitol in this attack. And we've been really clear and adamant that we don't need new law enforcement powers or new criminal statutes. We need the ability to to look at the events that led up to it, prosecute accordingly, go through the mountains of data that's necessary. But we need the political will to, most importantly, to do the proper investigation and prosecution of what happened. And that's absent in Congress, as we see. The way they've been, the members of Congress have been stonewalling the hearing, the panel that Speaker Pelosi has been trying to put together. Rather astonishing that we couldn't get a vote to have a look back commission the way we did with 9/11. I think it's just, we're going to do it. We're going to have a commission and a look back on what happened in January of 2021. It's a question of whether we get it now and get it started and get it while the information and the people are fresh, or we're going to have to grapple with this 10 or 15 years from now. And so I don't think the answer lies in giving, in enabling new statutes. And fortunately, I mean, here I love being an equal opportunity critic. My opponents are not Republicans. My opponents are sometimes the Democrats and the Biden administration, and we're like, no, hold on a minute. We don't think we need to grant these additional powers. And luckily, it hasn't gained traction because I think it's readily evident that we have different needs to prosecute the insurrectionists of January 2021. So we'll see how it evolves.
Do you think that perhaps there, as more of these cases are heard in court, that there's going to be sort of a groundswell of, maybe not a groundswell, maybe more than a trickle of people who are interested in having a commission to look what happened? Because more of the evidence is going to come out. It's no longer going to be accusations. Yes,
I do think the more that people understand. And I think the line that the secretary drew was a really important one for me, and I was heartened. This is why we agree on a lot. The line between thought and belief on the one hand and action on the other is really quite an important one. And it's important so that we don't become a nation that begins to criminalize or that begins to police thought or political beliefs. There are many who may have agreed with the insurrectionists in January, including some members of Congress and maybe some members of the Trump administration. But we really have to keep a very keen eye focused on, it's very different when you believe something versus the kind of the criminal action of storming the Capitol, breaking the doors, attacking the police officers, trespassing in offices, taking computers, hunting members of Congress, literally hunting on the Capitol grounds. And the idea that we are not even willing to have that type of reckoning, I think we're gonna have it. We're gonna have to have it, and it's just lamentable that we can't seem to start it now.
Right.
I don't know if anyone, Secretary, do you disagree with me? Do you think ultimately, am I too optimistic in thinking that we'll have a reckoning around January? I was trying to read your countenance.
Yeah, no, I think we not only will we have a reckoning, we need to have a reckoning. We need to really understand the genesis of what happened, what were the predicates. We need to understand where the breakdown happened in the sharing of information with the Capitol Police and why weren't they better prepared. We need to understand the damage that was actually done to the Capitol and to the Congress. And so, I, like you, Anthony, I do not understand why there was resistance to having an independent 9/11 style commission looking at January the 6th. And I was just left to wonder, what were the opponents afraid of?
And Secretary Napolitano, do you think that as more of these court cases are actually heard in public, that sentiment will change? Or do you think it's just so partisan it can't happen?
Well, I think we live in poisonously partisan times. And so I'm not that optimistic. What we may actually learn a lot from is the commission or the committee, excuse me, that was ultimately established in the House, because they've already started with a pretty broad ranging set of document requests and the like. So I think they're intent on doing a very serious overall investigation as to what happened.
So let me ask the three. Sorry, go ahead,
I think it's also really important for this committee's investigation to give us, if it can, a shared sense of history. One of the more alarming developments since January 6th is this counter narrative that it was just tourism. It wasn't really anything serious. And I think that not only for the current generation of policymakers, but for future generations of policymakers, we need to have a shared understanding of what actually happened, as well as why it actually happened. I think it's one of the great values of the 9/11 Commission in publicizing its hearings and making that information available. And I hope the Congressional Committee, I too was stunned we couldn't get a commission, perhaps not terribly surprised given our polarizing politics, but the work of this committee is incredibly important.
And I would have thought, I mean, I very much appreciate Professor Ziegart. I very much would have thought that some of the establishment in the Republican Party would have been more adamant and outspoken about it, because I think the silence is more damning than I think the facts would be. I mean, I developed a relationship with Jared Kushner when he was in the West Wing working on criminal justice reform in the First Step Act, and we didn't agree on a lot, and we sued them a lot more than we were able to agree on, and yet I have to believe that the individuals who served in government, who want to make sure that the record is straight, that such an inquiry is going to help them in terms of their standing in the history books. And so I've not discussed this with Jared. If I did, I wouldn't kiss and tell. That's not my style. But I think it, for all of the leadership, to kind of really get to the bottom of it so that it doesn't hang over as a cloud. And I think it's critically important for the functioning. I do think it will, perhaps I'm just overly optimistic and naive, but I do think that ultimately we'll come back to reckon with this. And there was resistance, as we all remember, to the 9/11 Commission in the early days. I mean, that we didn't get that done very easily. And slowly, bit by bit, you had, Senator Feinstein and the Democrats and the Republicans come together, and I think all to the good. And the fact that it was bipartisan and that it had multiple people from different levels of government with a very large staff that produced, how long was the report? I forget, 700 some odd pages?
This thick.
Yeah.
Right.
I had to,
And very well written.
And the thing is that it was unanimous. Every word was agreed to by every member of the commission.
and there was a lot that was at stake in that report. We were talking about the illegality of government action. I don't know. I've heard it asserted, because it's always on MSNBC and elsewhere, and I don't believe everything I hear on cable TV, but it's not clear to me that this was, commissioned or committed at the highest levels of our government in the way that torture was. And yet here we were able to both do the torture report and the 9/11 report, really investigating what was objectively criminal conduct. And we were able to do it in a bipartisan way. Certainly we ought to be able to do it here.
And let me just sort of put this umbrella over it as well, is that this extreme partisanship seems to be becoming a security risk in and of itself. Can you talk a little bit about that, Secretary Napolitano?
Well, I think that's one way to look at it, because it prevents the country from really grappling with the serious problems that we have. The fact that we can't really fix our immigration system, the fact that we really haven't dealt with climate and climate change adequately, the fact that We have this rise of social media and misinformation, disinformation on social media. Well, what do we do about that? What is the role, as Professor Ziegert said, of the private sector there? What should we require? What is the role of the private sector that controls our critical infrastructure? Should they be required to meet certain minimum cybersecurity standards? These are big existential issues that go to risk facing the country, and yet we're so riven between the two political parties that it really seems almost impossible for the Congress, at least, to grapple with them.
What do you think, Professor Ziegert?
I think, we talk about the threat landscape. I think the greatest national security threat to us today is ourselves. I think this polarization, as Secretary Napolitano mentioned, hinders our ability to solve all of our major problems, whether they're domestic problems like K-12 education, climate change. And of course, we're in great power competition again as well. So, as we think about the emerging threat from China, which is both economic and security, we're in a world where, as you know, Dina, technologies are inherently dual use. So it used to be in the Cold War that technology was sort of created in the Pentagon and then spun off to the commercial sector for a variety of purposes. But now all the major technologies, artificial intelligence, miniaturization of satellites, they're inherently dual use. They can be used for commercial gain as well as military application. This is a dramatically different threat landscape, and we're not going to be able to deal with the competition abroad if we're so polarized within.
Yeah. Do you want to add to that, Anthony?
No, just a here, and I agree. It's wonderful. It's not often I can agree with the former head of the Department of Homeland Security and someone at the Hoover Institute. And I just think the divisiveness in our country is really going to be a pox on all of our houses. And I think it's, I think it makes those of us who are trying to make a difference on policy issues, it makes our work increasingly difficult. I mean, it's not, I'm very open about the fact that I did go to the Kushner West Wing, the Trump West Wing. I was invited, I engaged, I didn't change my mind. I kept suing them as I needed to, but I thought it was incumbent upon me to engage. And there were some in my organization and some in my ecosystem who would have preferred me not to engage. And I think that would have been a mistake. But I understand that reasonable people will differ. I think this reasonable person believes we need to kind of find a way across the party aisle. And on these issues, especially, it's on all the issues. It's climate change, it's voter integrity. And we all have an interest in having secure electoral systems, that we want to make sure that votes are properly cast and properly counted and that they're meaningful in the process. Yet, I think the way that we conceive of ensuring that is where we part company with some individuals across the political spectrum. And I think the more we can try to find a way to de-escalate, although at some level you just got to fight for what you believe in, but lamentably the political climate is not getting any easier or any better. I think the immigration issue, the idea that we shouldn't see the immigration flows as a security threat in the way that we view Russia or China or other kind of foreign actors, I think is critically important. But unfortunately, the 9/11 guise and patina has placed, the immigration center or the immigration kind of locus of activity of our government in a security paradigm. And I think that's a mistake. And we can get into it a little bit more later on if you wish. But I think the divisiveness is terribly problematic. And I do think the social media and the new tech companies have a lot to do with it, and we need to hold them accountable. And I think the type of kind of regulation and scrutiny and questioning that we need to ask of them, I'm all in. I'm not sure I will agree with Professor Ziegert on what the regs would be around Facebook and Twitter or Secretary Napolitano. I'm not sure, but I think that's the conversation to have, and I think I relish the opportunity to have it.
And the panel is still young, so that conversation may come up. So you'll have plenty of time to disagree with DHS and the Hoover Institute as we move on here. So I feel remiss if we didn't actually talk a bit about Afghanistan, given what's happened. And I think we've all been following what has happened over the last couple of weeks quite carefully. Al-Qaeda was in Afghanistan when it planned the 9/11 attacks. And there are legitimate questions as to whether or not this will be deja vu all over again. So, Secretary Napolitano, looking forward, how is the withdrawal from Afghanistan going to affect our security?
Well, I think we probably don't know the full extent of the effect, but I think we can reasonably foresee there'll be some degradation in our ability to collect intelligence. We won't have the kind of resources on the ground that we have had. I think there's going to be some sort of impact in terms of how other countries view the United States, in terms of our willingness to commit resources, to sustain resources. I think that tale is yet to be told. So, one good thing I'll say is we're now out of Afghanistan, and we're no longer going to be spending billions of dollars a year in Afghanistan, and I think that's a good decision. But the after effects are yet to be told.
Are you in the camp that thinks that Al-Qaeda will come back into Afghanistan?
Yeah, I'm not sure that Al-Qaeda ever really went away, but I do think that's one of the impacts could be on the intelligence that we get and can have on a real-time basis with respect to Al-Qaeda or any resurgence of an Al-Qaeda-like organization.
Right. So, Professor Ziegart, I've always found it incredibly ironic that the Taliban wants to bring Afghanistan back to the caliphate times, but uses social media so effectively. And how do we combat that? How do we? Is there something the platforms can do? Anything the U.S. government can do? Cybercom hacked ISIS in a story I did for NPR about a year ago. Should they be hacking the Taliban too, to make it harder for them to get their message out?
So, Tina, you've raised a really important question, which is we have old adversaries empowered by new technologies dealing with us in new ways. So it's not just that emerging technologies are the tools of Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, the most active in cyberspace, but they empower everybody. So this is a new battleground, and it's a battleground for recruitment. It's a battleground for our minds. How do we deal with that? I wish I had a really good answer for you. I think what we're seeing is Cyber Command leaning much more forward in hacking our adversaries and taking the fight to foreign networks before they come here. I think it's the right move. It's not enough, but I think it's a move in the right direction. We know we didn't deter a whole lot by sitting back and playing perimeter defense here in the United States because it doesn't work in cyberspace. But the key question, I think, for whether it's stopping terrorists in their recruiting or stopping Russian election interference is psychology. How do we think about inoculating our society from being manipulated at scale? Because what we're talking about is tools of mass deception in cyberspace, whether they're utilized by domestic actors or foreign actors. So how do we then harness the insights of psychology to understand what keeps people from getting manipulated? How do we know these things when we see them? And how can we use that capability to erode the efforts of foreign actors like Al-Qaeda? So I think Cyber Command has started down that path. But if you look at the Facebook Oversight Board, for example, there's not one expert in psychology on that board, right? We need to, what's the right expertise to deal with this moment? It's not where the expertise was in the Cold War, even exactly where it was post 9/11. We have to think more expansively.
Yeah, one of the terms I've heard out of Arliss about this, the University of Maryland think tank, this is known as cognitive security, trying to secure the 6 inches, or in your all cases, 8 inches between your ears, that makes people persuade you to do things. And Anthony, this is a bit of a bank shot off that, but
Yeah.
we've seen a lot of these ransomware attacks. We've seen stolen information from nation state actors.
Yeah.
The NSA and Cybercom have said they're fighting with one hand behind their back
Yeah.
because they can't what we call sniff or take a look at domestic networks. What do you, and they have to be outward facing, as Professor Ziegart said. Perimeter, what did you call it? Perimeter defense, which is a really great term. So given current events, do we have to look at this again?
We can always look at it again. It's a question of how we decide it. And I guess I would part company with some of the recommendations that have been made, that we need more surveillance to answer the threats of like the SolarWinds attack or others. I'm not convinced. And I think it's a preferable role for me to play the skeptic in this process. But I do want to come back to a second on Afghanistan. The ACLU doesn't take a position on war. Our issues around the declaration of war is only from a process perspective, because that power is entrusted to Congress. And so our concerns have always been about whether or not when we go to war and the authorizations of the use of force is sufficient specific in terms of the enemy or the geography or the targets. And when we raise concerns, there are procedural concerns, not kind of substantive concerns about the proper reason to be in Afghanistan or leave. That being said, we are still very much concerned about how these wars or non-wars get waged. And I was troubled when I heard kind of a very bellicose President Biden say, "We will never forgive, we will never forget." And it was indeed evocative of the way in which President Obama used excessive executive power in targeting what we believe was an extrajudicial killing of individuals outside of the specter of the battlefield. And it was a place where we really did part company with the administration at the time. And I worry about the evolution of these kind of technologies to fight wars, but that kind of skirt the system of checks and balances in place, where the war powers is more concentrated in the hands of the executive. And I think these kind of drone killing programs, and you remember Secretary Napolitano, I don't think that was in your era. I think it was with Jay Johnson when he was at the department. But we really did lock horns with the administration on behalf of Anwar al-Awlaki, who was being targeted in Yemen, not the subject of an official declaration of war, a U.S. citizen.
Let me just jump in here. Anwar al-Awlaki, for people who don't recognize the name, was an American-born, I think it's safe to say, radical cleric who started out as just having a huge propaganda following on YouTube channels and various people. A lot of the people who went to go and fight for ISIS and Al Qaeda had a connection to Anwar al-Awlaki. Go ahead.
And
Sorry.
And he was on the government's target list. They even bragged about it, that he was on their list, and that the president himself was reviewing who was on the list and authorizing it. I found that breathless at the moment. Usually one works very hard to keep the commander-in-chief's fingerprints off of such an operation, but this time they were kind of very explicit and saber rattling. And and Anwar al-Awlaki's father came to us and said, "Won't you please try to do something? Why is his government hunting him down outside of an active battlefield without judge, jury, or kind of where's the innocence of the benefit of innocence?" And ultimately, we lost that litigation, and he lost his life, including Anwar al-Awlaki's son, who went to find his father and was mistakenly picked up by one of these drone attacks. He was also a U.S. citizen. I think he was 17, if I remember correctly. It's all memory.
16 or 17, yeah.
16 or 17. So I remember that.
Here's the thing about Alaki is a really tough case, and
Yeah.
Anthony, I'll give to you that killing an American citizen abroad is not a decision that should be made easily or frequently. But Alaki was an unusual case. He was not just a recruiter. He was a planner. He was an operator. He was directly connected with plots against Americans and on American soil. And yet he was hiding in Yemen,
Yeah.
outside the reach of law enforcement in the United States. So you have this tension between, our due process, our judicial values, but also our security values. When somebody is taking positions and making actions that are directly contrary to the safety of Americans.
I don't doubt that the administration and those involved, and perhaps you or others, were convinced of that. However, when you are talking about matters of life or death, you'll forgive me if I just remain skeptical in terms of that is not a decision one only vests in a sitting US president or a general. That we do believe these due process rights and the innocence until proven, you don't get a chance to release them if you get the evidence wrong. There's no way to conjure him back on earth. And so I'm just still stunned by and again, I was very critical of of President Obama. I'm an equal opportunity critic. It's why I don't go to many dinner parties. I don't get invited out much more. The pandemic has been perfect for me because I just get to stay in my dining room where I am now. But I think it's something that concerns me. I've had these discussions and debates and even sometimes polite arguments with friends like Harold Coe and others who I know I disagree with. But that being said, I mean, I want to go back to the question you asked about, do we need to think differently about what the solution is? I mean, we should have those discussions. I would love to know, and I know Professor Ziegart, you're much more expert on this than I am, and I was able to read a bunch of what you've written and watch another recent lecture you gave at the Hoover Institute, which I found really informative. But I haven't yet been fully convinced, and maybe folks can send me information or correct me, that the events that led to the SolarWinds hack was really kind of a lapse in intelligence authority powers, or just a lapse in intelligence gathering. I don't fully understand how how it happened, how they got into all these massive systems. And I understand that you're saying that there's more a focus on the perimeter than there is on looking externally. I've heard the same criticisms around the Einstein program, of which I'm a novice on this, so I'm really getting.
I don't know that you're going to find people on this panel going, "Yay, Einstein really works."
I
think
understand.
We all agree on that one.
Exactly. So I think before we figure out, let's give them more powers. Let's figure out why it didn't work this last time around, and I'd love to understand it a little bit better. And the fact that we haven't spent a lot of time delving into this massive hack, I think I just will have to remain skeptical about granting additional law enforcement or surveillance powers to the government.
I'm not sure the SolarWinds one is the best example of this, because that had to do with a supply chain in which I just did a huge story for NPR on this, so I heard ridiculously knowledgeable about it.
I pulled that up too. I know.
5 minutes in, you go on to something else. So the idea was, in that case, that was different because it was a company that was in the supply chain that had its own security issues. Perhaps a better example, and your point is a good one, would be Microsoft Exchange.
Yes.
Where that was missed. And there's a real sense that if they were able to see some of the network, they were using servers in the US that they couldn't see, and they were dumping the information into servers in the US. And then just to set the table there, Professor Ziegart, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so just a couple points. So first, I want to circle back to something, Anthony, that you said before. So yes, I'm a member of the Hoover Institution. There's no one Hoover Institution view.
No, I
Right.
know.
So
It's the
my
same thing
colleagues
with-
and I have conversations like we're having. You get two academics in a room, you get 5 opinions, right? So I just want to make clear that there is no one view that represents the institution. I'm here representing my own view, and I disagree with my colleagues there too.
Yep.
But it's really important to have those conversations because
I
we
appreciate
get a different perspective. With respect to cyber, some people are recommending more authorities, but I think the Biden administration has been pretty careful about saying they don't want additional authorities. So I feel like that's a bit of a straw man argument at this point. The real focus, and I applaud the administration for doing this, has been on how can they work more with the private sector to really have something more robust. So I know Ann Neuberger, the Deputy National Security Advisor, has said, we go into restaurants and we have a grade. We know how what the health of the restaurant is, right? The ABC. Is it a good place to eat or not? We don't have that with software. We don't have that with products. So we have basic capabilities that the government requires in all aspects of our life, whether it's seatbelts or food service organizations, that we don't have in cyberspace. And that is leaving our country exceptionally vulnerable to massive theft of IP and to potential crippling attacks on our election infrastructure and other things. So if we think about what's the biggest threat that keeps me up at night now, it's cyberspace, right? This is an arena where it's empowering the weak, and the strongest are actually the most vulnerable because we're so digitally connected and we have these freedoms of a democracy that makes us susceptible to manipulation.
But I also think I agree, but can I just jump in for a second, a two-finger intervention? I mean, I agree and I disagree because I think part of the reason why some of these systems are insecure is because the government likes it that way. I mean, because it creates back doors for them to exploit ways into systems that they were, that allowed them to do their, whether it's perimeter or other type of surveillance. And in some ways, it's both the idea that they create opportunities for the government to conduct surveillance that they otherwise wouldn't be able to do. And I have to also point out the kind of hypocrisy of government that's trying to sometimes take on some of the tech companies on encryption and kind of and fighting them tooth and nail on end-to-end encryption. I mean, we had to jump in on the Apple litigation when it's the government itself who's trying to make the Apple iOS system less secure.
I completely agree with you on
I'm
that.
having a hard time saying, oh, we don't have these systems to be so secure when in fact the government is trying its very best to exploit the vulnerabilities and then to kind of crash down the systems that are more secure.
I think it's really important to be more specific about the government. The government is not a monolith. There were really different views within the U.S. government about that Apple FBI. Should Apple be forced to weaken its own encrypted products for law enforcement to access the cell phone of a person who killed in a terrorist attack? There was vigorous debate within the U.S. government, within individual organizations. So not everybody believes in weakening encryption in the U.S. government, and it's really important to be specific about that.
And in that particular case also, in a lot of ways, that's a terrible case to use. I know it's the one everybody does, but it wasn't even his phone. It was the state's phone,
right.
And the state had given permission for it, right? So there were like all these things that would have made it not be quite as expansive as what you're talking about, Anthony. So that case, everybody sort of talks about it as being the big Apple encryption case, but there were all kinds of things about it that actually weren't as crazy as they seemed on the surface.
Yeah, where I will agree is also going back to kind of being an equal protector critic, equal opportunity critic, is these oversight mechanisms within these companies are a complete joke. The Facebook oversight board, I mean, come on, right? It's it's just they make little recommendations to Zuck. And then he sees whether or not he wants to even abide by them. And it's just, there's some wonderful people on the board. I know some of them and they work hard on it, but it's not as if you can really think that that's a proper check and balance on the place. And it's a lot more window dressing than it is kind of an accountability mechanism. I mean,
but
maybe
it's a start.
Evolve.
Isn't it a start?
Yeah.
So we give him credit for the start, but I think most people would land around the same place. Amy, let me ask a question a little bit differently than Anthony did. This is the question he was getting to in terms of government, the monolith, reaching in. During the Microsoft Exchange hack, the Chinese hackers had put backdoors on tens of thousands of systems of like mom and pop shops, dentist office, malls, schools. And the FBI was able to get a court order that allowed it to sort of reach in to the internet more generally and grab these web shells or these backdoors off all these systems without asking for permission first. And you could say this is a very, for all the right reasons. Is it worrisome that they did that?
Well, I think, Anthony would be surprised, and I'm probably going to agree with him more than he might think. In that particular case, I think it was the right thing to do, but there's always the concern that once you give the government agencies powers for all sorts of good reasons, that conditions change and then those powers remain. And then how are they going to be used? We see this with the use of local law enforcement with AI facial recognition systems, right? So not a lot of accountability there either. So the question is, how can we have rigorous oversight mechanisms so that there is accountability, whether it's legislative branch oversight or executive branch oversight. And there, I think process really does matter. I suspect Anthony and I may disagree about things related to NSA warrantless wiretapping after 9/11, but there was oversight. And I think that the American people didn't believe in the oversight regime. So congressional oversight has to be more robust. It has to be more rigorous than it is. And there are very weak incentives for Congress to exercise oversight over technology. Most members of Congress are lawyers, they're not engineers. The technology is complicated, and it takes the thing most valuable for a member of Congress, which is time, right? So I think it's naturally hard to get good oversight over these areas.
Secretary Napolitano, if you'd been sitting in your secretary seat when this Microsoft Exchange thing happened and CISA came to you, the agency that sort of helps watch over these sorts of issues, and said, hey, I think the FBI needs to go in there and grab these web shells. And we don't have time to tell every single one of these people that we need to do it. And I'm not saying that I'm on either side of this. What would have been your response?
My response would have been to say, how extensive is the breach? What kind of time would it take? What kind of damage can be done while we're going through that process, so that you could weigh, on the one hand, the kind of time it would take to alert everybody that you're going to be going in and fixing the situation, versus just going ahead and doing it and authorizing the FBI to do it.
Right. Yeah, and I guess the other thing I should say is.
Yeah, the point I want to make is these questions we're talking, they're not easy. They're not black or white for the most part. They're very situational, and you really have to dive in and understand what the risks you're trying to mitigate and the costs and benefits of the decisions you're being called upon to make.
Yeah, and just putting one more layer over that decision for people who might not have been geekily following this in the same way I was. There was a real concern that there was going to be a second wave of attacks, which would be ransomware. So your dentist office, your mom and pop shop, all these different places would all of a sudden find their systems locked up. So it wasn't just that the web shells were sitting there. It was a concern that the next thing would happen, which I'm sure would have been in the calculus if you had been in the seat and they'd been asking you.
Oh yeah, for sure.
What do you think, Anthony? What do you think about the FBI getting a court order and actually changing things on the network without permission? I know you're not a big geek. I'm just sort of on
No. I've been trying to. I have to wait for Professor Ziegard's textbook to come out before I can kind of pretend to sit for this exam. But I've tried to brush up on it. I mean, look, it was a necessary solution to kind of a problem at the time. I'm a pragmatist. I sometimes get criticized from the left because of it. Don't like it, but I understand it. At the same time, I also want to probe a little bit further about what the government did not, how the government did not know earlier, and I want to hold, and we can talk about which agencies, Amy. I think you're totally right that it's not a monolith, and there are different cultures and different approaches and different competencies and different abilities, right? Because there are some parts of the government that you wouldn't trust to kind of turn, you know, to fix the carburetor on my 2011 Audi. And there are others that you would allow them to kind of really kind of, you know, drive future technologies. But I'm still trying to understand it. And I know I'm a guy of somewhat more than average intelligence, and I'm doing this for 20 years. And if it's vexing for me, oh my God, then how can we really expect the public to play kind of an informed role? I mean, I think we have to really rethink kind of informed consent, the engagement with the public, oversight in Congress. I totally agree that needs to be rethought and revamped. I mean, I'm struck by a number of different things I've been reading in prep for today. It's just like, you know, in the WannaCry program, right? Where I read from some of my own technologists, we did hire a bunch of computer scientists on payroll because we think code is policy, and I don't understand code. So I have, you know, 4 or 5 individuals who are trained as computer scientists who come to us from the tech world. And, you know, I was reading some of their writings, what they understand, and then they write it for folks like me who don't understand the technology all that well. You know, it was the idea that in the WannaCry program, the government knew about the vulnerabilities in Microsoft and didn't really disclose it. It's just, I find vexing and troubling. And it's only after that they did do it. And I think it requires a whole rethink of oversight, both oversight from Congress, public oversight, judicial oversight. I think it's anemic. You know, the one place where I'll pick an argument, a polite one, and with great respect and deference, Amy, but, you know, I did listen to the talk you gave at Hoover where you said that the NSA disclosure about Edward Snowden of the NSA wiretapping program in the end showed that nothing was found to be unlawful or illegal. I don't know how you can say that. I will send you the opinion in the Second Circuit, which was our case, where the judge patently said that the NSA's mass, you know, the Section 215 program was not constitutional. It's a Second Circuit opinion at the federal court. I don't know what more is a definition of illegality, but when a court strikes down an aspect of that program that, you know, obviously then was revised and then now is sunset. But I think it's in that context that I am very comfortable and very contented in my skepticism. And I just want to be like Saint, you know, I'm not a saint, but Saint Paul, you know, I want to see the proof. St. Peter, rather, right? St. Peter's the one who wanted to kind of, you can see how good a saint I am. But I want the proof. I want to be able to touch it before I kind of grant the authorities that are requested. And I think, you know, the NSA wiretap, I would do this to just be provocative, make for good TV and make your job as a moderator. I think Edward Snowden was a hero. I think he did us a service. I actually believe, I've met Ed Snowden. I've gone to Moscow several times. I made personally the decision before we took him on as a client. I think, you know, I am myself, I haven't seen the files that other government officials have, but I am sure that I have queried his conscience and what his motivations were. And I am convinced that he did us a service that started a debate that was not happening in this country. And I think that as a result of it, you know, each of the branches of government, the courts, Congress, and the executive branch all reformed their surveillance policies as a result of the Snowden revelations. So I stack that all up and say that I think our society grappling with these issues was served by the revelations of Ed Snowden. And I will say, I put him in a very different camp than I put Julian Assange, who I've also met, but don't have the same kind of assessment.
Warm, fuzzy feeling?
Well, I think Julian is self-published. He felt like he knew what was going to be in the public interest, and he just took the data and just put it on the web and then let it all play out as it did. Ed took all the data and then turned it over to the newspapers and the outlets. And then the editors of these publications made a decision of what was in the public interest. And there were programs and there were revelations that were never publicly revealed because the New York Times or Der Spiegel or the
Washington
Guardian
Post.
made a decision that it was going to harm the public interest, and so never ran stories that we might know about, that we as his lawyers might know about. So I hope that kind of got everyone's energy going at my,
No,
my
that's
time.
good. That
It's-
got us right down the
Yeah.
Snowden rabbit hole. Before we get any further down the Snowden rabbit hole, which is deep and wide,
Yeah.
would Professor Ziegart or Secretary Napolitano, do you want to just respond to that? And then we'll sort of climb out of this hole and go on to our 9/11 retrospective.
Sure. So it will surprise no one that I completely disagree with what Anthony said. Respectfully, I do like having these conversations. I think Edward Snowden was a traitor. I don't think he was a hero. I think there's a lot of evidence that suggests that he didn't just take what was in front of him for altruistic reasons because he believed in democracy. He stole information that was classified. He used social engineering to acquire information that had no relationship to mass surveillance or privacy. It just damaged the United States. More than 1 million documents that he revealed. So I think there was grave damage. Bipartisan reports suggest there was grave damage to the United States as a result of his illegal theft and revelation of classified material. So I think Anthony and I are never going to convince each other of the other one's view, but it's an important conversation to have. With respect to the legality of warrantless wiretapping, I will say this. I think that what we saw was American democracy working. That once some of these programs were revealed, there was a real discussion in Congress. There was a national review by the Obama administration, which, by the way, found the programs were legal, right? But there was discomfort with the extent of some of what the NSA was doing. And so that box, right, those lines were redrawn for the agency. And we have a different regime now as a result of that democratic discussion. That's the best of our democracy functioning, right? When we have these things where we have a deliberative body come in and draw new rules around which the American people are comfortable. But I will say this, I'm really concerned. And the reason why I wrote this book, and I'm now teaching a new class at Stanford, go Cardinal, sorry, Secretary Napolitano. But the reason I wrote this new book is that I think the American people don't know much about the intelligence community. And we can't have a reservoir of support, of serious conversation, of serious oversight in ignorance. Most of what we know about the intelligence community, people learn from the movies. And that is a dangerous state of affairs for the United States. Secret agencies always have this tension operating in democracies. Right? That is a natural tension. And we have to have understanding and education for that, for us to be able to grapple with what Secretary Napolitano talked about, the costs and benefits, the difficult trade-offs that policymakers have to make. And they can't do that with an ill-informed policymaking and public community.
Yeah, one thing that I would add to that, without expressing my opinion on Snowden, but the problem of overclassification within the government. So, and that creates its own area for mischief. And the plain fact of the matter is that those who are stamping those documents never get punished for stamping something top secret. But if they don't, they could suffer. In other words, the incentives are not in the right place. And to me, one of the things I saw when I was secretary was just a tremendous overuse of the classification system.
The one thing I would add, I mean, not to kind of continue a disagreement, but I agree that we began to see democratic processes work as they should as a result of the outcomes. Both Congress and the federal branch, even President Obama said that we were having a healthy debate. I think he commented it that way. It was his words, if I remember correctly. I think the only thing I might disagree on is that, and maybe this it ties back to the overclassification issue and the lack of a window into the process, is that for private citizens to challenge policies, when you're kind of completely in the dark, it's really hard to kind of find a way to kind of challenge them in court or in Congress. And The Ed Snowden revelations, I'll just say this and then we can move on because I don't think we're going to disagree, but I respect that we will disagree and I understand where you are coming from, Professor Ziegart. But we tried to sue under the NSA wiretapping, the surveillance program, Section 215. We brought a lawsuit. We got bounced out of court because we had no standing. The very first document that Ed leaked was a particular, we had searched, we had dozens of potential plaintiffs in the first lawsuit. But because I couldn't show that we were subject to the type of surveillance that we knew was happening, but that we were not knowledgeable that whether the plaintiffs were the subject of that surveillance, we were bounced out of court. First document Ed released was a Verizon business order that showed an NSL with customers of the Verizon Business Network. Guess who has a contract with Verizon Business? The ACLU. So immediately I got standing. First document out of the Ed Snowden tranche. That is the case that went all the way up to the Supreme Court that ultimately we did prevail upon in 2015. Ultimately, we couldn't even get into the arena without that first document. So I think we talk about the need for checks and balances, and I just think we need to kind of think strategically and creatively about how do you create the apertures and the data that allow people to contest it. But I think it's a useful discussion.
I need to pull us back to
Okay,
to 9/11, and I mean, this is an interesting and important conversation. And let's be honest, NSA and cyber and all these things are the threats that we're looking at now post 9/11. So it's not really quite off the beaten path here, but it's a little bit. And for people who've just joined us, I'm Dina Temple-Raston, and we're talking with Secretary Janet Napolitano, Stanford's Amy Ziegart, and Anthony Romero of the ACLU about Homeland Security and security 20 years after 9/11. And so we've talked about the risks of polarization. We've talked about cyber. We've talked about Afghanistan. We talked one way or another about Edward Snowden. But I think that we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about two legacies of 9/11 that we're still dealing with today. And that is one, the Department of Homeland Security, which was created in 9/11's aftermath. And I think Secretary Napolitano, you told me it was the biggest government reorganization since 1947, which was kind of an amazing fact. And then the second legacy is the military commissions at Guantanamo. So let's start with DHS. Secretary Napolitano, since we have you here, if you could wave a wand, which I know DHS secretaries can do all the time, and fix one thing at DHS, what would it be?
I would, if I had a magic wand, I would separate border security from interior immigration enforcement and leave border security to DHS. It's very consistent with its mission, air, land, and sea. And I'd put interior immigration enforcement back in the Justice Department.
What do you think, Anthony? Because I know that immigration is one of the things that you've. Is that how you would like to change DHS? If you could only wave your wand to get one.
I might go a step further. I might grab the wand from Secretary Napolitano's hand and see if I can move more of the immigration service out of the Department of Homeland Security. Maybe
tell me why that's important in the in the context of 9/11.
Well, I mean, in the context of 9/11, in the context of the era of Donald Trump, especially. I mean, I think. I just worry that, I mean, I'll start philosophically, I'll be quick. The idea that we deal with the immigration arm of the government as part of the threats to the homeland, I always, it was too much for me to kind of, to countenance and to accept. And even when, we had good people in charge like Secretary Napolitano and Jay Johnson and Governor Ridge, I think did a very fine job as, in his best. But I have trouble with that part of our nation, the Emma Lazarus, Statue of Liberty in the Department of Homeland Security. So I would probably take more out and maybe grant it within DOJ or in the State Department. I don't know. I also think that I was concerned. I mean, part of what I was been a bit provocative on this one too is that I was watching the department secretary in the waning days of the Trump administration, and I was aghast at how DHS agents were being used, what seemed to be very political purposes that were giving me shivers down my civil libertarian spine. You know, the deployment of DHS agents in Portland.
Yeah.
The
Yep,
sweeping of people off the streets.
You know what?
who
I
were-
totally
and
agree
I
with
was
you.
just like, oh, so that I was done with the
Yeah.
department at that time. I'm just like, let's break the whole thing apart. We're ending the forever war. Let's end the forever Department of Homeland Security and get some security in, get a different way of thinking about security. And so I was worried. I mean, otherwise, the military had already backed off from being Donald Trump's lackey in the context of Lafayette Park. Excuse me for being so crass, but that's what I saw, right? And so they kind of realized that we have to get out of politics and back into kind of the neutral zone for the military. So Lafayette Park was a moment for them. So after Lafayette Park, the only thing that the president had left to command and control was DHS. And I was just like, oh my God, this is the biggest, you know, this is the second biggest agency, and there's a
Third.
lot to third. Okay. So I think I would go further, and let's have some oversight and some hearings, and let's have the conversation. We created it in the aftermath of 9/11. It is very much a 9/11 legacy. Let's revisit it. If we're leaving Afghanistan, let's revisit it all. Let's shut down the military commissions. That's where you were going, Dina. I don't think they haven't worked. That was you're going with that question. I don't say that you have an opinion, but you know, they haven't worked. It's absurd. I was reminded by one of my staff, we are still litigating in front of the military commissions. You know, we spent $13 million representing defendants in the military commissions. They're in pre-trial motions still. It's
For 20 years.
For
20 years of
20 plus
pre-trial motions,
years.
yeah.
Well,
the
and
9/11
what's
family members
ironic
deserve
there is, remember in 1993, there was an Al-Qaeda based truck bomb in the basement of the World Trade Center.
Correct. I remember.
And it was investigated by the FBI, and they identified the plotters. They were arrested. They were all tried in federal court in the American judicial system. So that system has been proven to work in a terrorist type situation. And I think we were perhaps too quick to set it aside when we established Gitmo.
But I think there's one thing I can add, Dina, if I could for a sec, is that one of the things I want to kind of put a spotlight on is so many of the national security policies and the war on terror responses. Really, the weight of that felt most acutely, at least domestically, on the Muslim, Arab, and the MEMSA South Asian communities. And I think we need to draw back have a conversation that we were having, but we were not really willing to kind of have as openly as we ought to now that we're not in the heat of the moment. But there's really a lot of these national security policies, the no-fly lists, the voluntary questioning of young Arab and Muslim men between the ages of 18 and 33 that Bob Mueller and the FBI kind of undertook, really requires a kind of a, you know, it's ironic that all these kind of liberals and progressives, that's who I will name, right, flocked to the streets and to the airports when Donald Trump passed the Muslim ban, right? Which was a Muslim ban, which we challenged in court and lost ultimately because he fixed it on the third try. And everyone was aghast that, you know, that he was targeting Muslim countries. Oh my God. But let's remember the policies on the war on terror and a lot of the domestic screening, the no-fly list. You look at who they're actually, you know, the laws passed on charitable giving, the impact that had on Muslim charities in particular. We issued a report in 2009. And so I don't think we can talk about the 9/11, even if we're looking forward, because part of the racist baggage of the 9/11 policies on the MEMSA, on the Muslim, South Asian, and Arab communities are still the legacy that we've got today. And I think it's a different moment. I think we should have a more kind of a more fulsome conversation about it. And I know, Amy, some of your scholarship has looked at actually the impact on communities, on people, which I think we have to, it's so easy to have a national security discussion and not ever talk about individuals, except if they're kind of like notorious kind of defendants. But there were massive numbers of people implicated by these policies that I just think bears mentioning for us. So thank you for allowing me the frolic and detour on it.
We had talked at the beginning of our conversation a little bit about domestic extremism.
Yeah.
Amy, how do you see the law and law enforcement sort of shifting? There's clearly a shift. I think that the January 6th cases, if I can just add my opinion for a second here, the January 6th cases are going so slowly because they're trying to figure out what that pivot is going to be and to be consistent. Given what you've done in the past about the way communities were focused on post 9/11, what do you think is going to happen with this?
Well, I wish I had a crystal ball, but I don't. I will say a couple of things. Anthony, I think you're right. I mean, I think, when we think about, although President Bush was very clear this was not an anti-Muslim response, I mean, he was very clear about that, and I credit him with that over time, I think, obviously, and particularly in the Trump administration, we really had an anti-Muslim tilt to the security conversation. At the same time, though, I think if we look at local law enforcement and differences across the United States, there were some real green shoots there. So I was part of a board created by the LA Police Department after 9/11, and it included leaders of the Muslim community. And the thinking then was that we have to engage the Muslim community and in support and collaboration, and that's the key, not only to who we are as a people, but to protecting the nation. And that was much more successful than some other models. So I think there are some bright spots in the response, but a lot of dark spots in the response too, particularly in the Trump administration.
And I do think that George Bush said the right things. He went to the Islamic Center in Manhattan. I give him credit for the words. However, the deeds, I mean, when you look at what John Ashcroft did in terms of the summary deportations in the early days after 9/11, they were, look at the research and the writings of individuals. Stephen Brill's book and after talked about how law enforcement agents were going down the telephone book in the quaint old days when you actually had a telephone book. And so I agree that there was at least a difference in the official statements from the Bush administration compared to the Trump administration. But I just think that it all came home to roost with the Trump administration. So we were not, I wasn't as surprised that would become kind of a scapegoat that the president would use in a very nativistic racist way. I don't use that word lightly. It took me years before I would use the word racist to describe the Trump administration. My colleagues were often critical of me because I would be reluctant to use it. But I think ultimately when you saw what played out and how they actually conceptualized policies, it was rooted in kind of views of ethnicity.
So I think, to get back to your question, I think, there are a couple takeaways. Number one, with the Trump administration, we see that so much of our democracy was rested on norms and not formal authorities, formal processes. And we see the dangers when we rest on norms, that where the weak spots are in our democracy. In terms of domestic terrorism, I think the FBI director has been very forthcoming about the domestic terrorist threat that we face, that it's much more serious, has accounted for more lives lost than jihadi terrorists coming in from the outside of the United States. So it's a real and present danger. It was, as Secretary Napolitano, I'm sure knows, before 9/11 in the 1990s, when we talked about, in the early 90s, when we talked about terrorism, it was domestic terrorism, Oklahoma City, for example. And the challenge here, again, is organizational too, right? So we have a National Counterterrorism Center, one of the success stories of the post 9/11 reforms, focused on international terrorism. We have the FBI focused on domestic terrorism. What happens when there's more of a nexus between particularly extreme right-wing groups, domestic and international? How are we going to fill those seams in a way that is cognizant of American civil liberties? These are hard challenges, and we're going to be facing them in the days ahead.
Right. So, and when you say a nexus, so for example, alt-right groups in Germany or something like that, inspiring people here.
Yes.
Right. So let me just remind people who are listening to the conversation that you can go to the YouTube chat and ask questions. And as soon as I get them, I'll ask them for you. And let me try and just switch the conversation a little bit, because I'm an optimist, very unjournalistic of me to be, but I'm a diehard optimist. I wanted to end on a more hopeful note. And Secretary Napolitano, Professor Ziegart, you're teaching students now who weren't even alive during 9/11. How do they learn from 9/11 in a visceral way?
Well, yeah, I'm actually co-teaching a course on security policy here at Berkeley. And we just had a lecture on 9/11. I had them read the 9/11 Commission report, which was revelatory to them. That report was written in a way different than other government reports. It was written as narrative history. It tells the story, and it's very powerful. And it's been a very impactful report. The recommendations from that commission, most of them have been turned into reality, with the exception of relieving some of the number of congressional committees that have oversight over the Department of Homeland Security, which is in excess of 100 committees and subcommittees. But
that's too few.
So, oversight can be overdone, I must say. But we began with the seminal document, which was the 9/11 Commission report. And then I described for them what I was doing on the morning of 9/11. I was the Attorney General of Arizona, was in Phoenix, waking up, getting ready for work. And all of a sudden on NPR, they announced that a plane has hit the World Trade Center. And I think it's an accident or something, and then a second plane hits, and I think, this doesn't sound like an accident to me, and then all heck broke loose, because we had questions out in the States. The governor wanted to know whether she could activate the Air National Guard to fly protection around the nuclear power plant outside Phoenix. Could she shut the border? Should she cancel school? Should we cancel the Major League Baseball game that night? And there was nobody in Washington, D.C. to call. There was no playbook. And so we were really starting from scratch at the state level. And so that's how I introduce our students to 9/11.
So Dina, I wrote a piece recently in the Atlantic about teaching about 9/11 since 9/11. So on that day, I was in California and saw the World Trade Center towers collapse on television as I was feeding my kids breakfast. And as a professor, the only thing you know how to do is teach, right? We're trying to make sense of the world. That's the business we're in. And so I drove to campus and with some colleagues held a seminar. And, as I wrote, we didn't have good answers that day about what went wrong. I had written about intelligence and studied intelligence before. I didn't have good answers, but I had questions. And what I realized from my students that day, and there was so much emotion in that classroom, people were crying. I mean, I remember it like it was yesterday. But what I remember most is that it was okay not to have answers in the moment, that asking questions together and inquiring together and having a conversation together, that community learning is an act of community, that was enough on that one day. When I look now, and my own daughter is a freshman in college, and so I'm very acutely aware of how old I am and how she didn't live through 9/11, and everything I say is very outdated, like the Peloponnesian War. When I think about students today, I think it's really important to show them, not just tell them. And so thanks to UCLA, I got a grant for a research assistant to put together a montage. And it's awful to watch, right? It's very emotional. 4 minutes, what it's like to live through the day. watching newscasters as they're discovering what's happening, watching New Yorkers covered in the dust, right, from the World Trade Center collapse as they're evacuating the city, stunned, watching policymakers, watching the Pentagon on fire, 4 minutes. And I show that, and they don't have to watch it, right? But I show it, and almost everybody does. And you can see, I mean, I've had giant football players with tears streaming down their face after they watched this 4 minutes. I want them to feel what it was like to experience this day because it was so important for our nation. And then what I do, it's not just enough to have them live through it, but then I say, now here's your assignment. You're a member of the National Security Council, and you've got to decide what to do. Because that's what our policymakers have had to do. And I think we often forget, I'm a political scientist. We treat political science like it's Spock-like. You have options, you try to maximize the benefits and minimize the costs. But policymakers sitting in those seats, carrying the burden of government, are human beings, and they're doing the best they can. And to try to understand with some empathy of how hard it is to make those foreign policy choices is a critical part of teaching about 9/11 today, I think.
So my first day at CNN in New York was September 11th, 2001. So I never knew New York before 2001. I only know post 9/11 New York. So Anthony, let me twist just give the question a little tweak.
Yeah.
Young lawyers coming into the ACLU who didn't experience 9/11. How do you put that into a legal framework for them so they understand?
I think luckily we documented a lot of what we were doing in real time, both in our legal actions and in annual reports. I pulled out the annual report from 2002, which was January, right, 3 months after, and it kind of chronicles it in real time. And luckily, the organization takes, we're 101 years old, and so we take the history kind of somewhat seriously. You actually learn a lot from your own history. And the ACLU was born out of the Palmer raids, very similar moment as 9/11, where the immigrants at that time were being deported by Mitchell Palmer. We had the courage of standing up to a very popular president in FDR when we challenged Japanese American internment, one of only 2 groups in America who dared to question FDR. Lost that case in the Supreme Court, obviously. We totally shrugged in the 1950s. When the moment of the House of Un-American Activities, the ACLU was largely missing in action. Some of our offices did okay, but the leadership was really problematic. We shared the minutes of our board meetings with J. Edgar Hoover. We expelled communists from our board. We kind of shrugged because we were worried about being shut down by Hoover. And it was that history that kind of, for me, was instructive. And like, oh my God, I don't want to be the guy who's like the guy who was running this place in the 1950s. I want to be like Baldwin with Korematsu. And so I think if you pass down that history well enough, and if we have an archive that is rather thorough, and then the clients and the communities. I mean, I do want to say that part of what I don't think we have fully dealt with was the impact on the Muslim and South Asia. I know I sound like a broken horse, but we were literally pulling a broken record, rather. Sorry, English is my second language, so sometimes I mix the metaphors. My father would do that, and I actually spoke English first, but I use that as an excuse. But we were targeting kind of. I mean, it was John Ashcroft was literally rounding people up. Most of them, South Asians. We couldn't get the data from our own government. Where I got the list of people who had been detained and then summarily deported? I got them from the embassies, especially the Pakistani embassy, because I figured out that the Vienna Convention meant that our government was probably informing the embassies and the consulates when they were deporting people. So I was able to write to the ambassador, the consular general of Pakistan in New York. I'm like, do you have a name? Do you have the list and the names and the phone numbers of the people that Ashcroft is deporting? I was litigating to get it from the US government. I got it from the Pakistani embassy. And then I tracked them down in Pakistan with a documentary film crew to show that these were shopkeepers and cab drivers and newspaper stand owners. And these were good people that we just totally kind of ripped up in our moment of racist xenophobia and deported them because we were wanting to kind of keep us safe from another terrorist attack. And I think that the story evolves from there. But I think having to tell those narratives, I think it's great, Amy, that you show the images, because those images are important. And I'm a New Yorker. I was in DC on 9/11. I had just started the week before 9/11. Talk about timing. Me and Bob Mueller showed up at the job at the same time. And, we learned how to kind of really adapt. And I think the organization, I think the best we do is just to kind of make sure that we kind of ask the tough questions, even when they're unpopular. And it was liberals and progressives who were as afraid and as complicit in the silence. I mean, I need to say this so I don't sound like a kind of a partisan hack, which I really adamantly opposed any folks who put me in that categorization, because I really think our issues are bigger and broader. And but it was, I remember the conversations early on. Senator Wellstone, may he rest in peace, knew that the Patriot Act was bad law and said, well, we can't challenge the president. We just need to get behind him. Senator Kennedy voted for the Patriot Act. Only Russ Feingold voted against it. Senator Schumer, Senator Biden. And many of them knew precisely. Some of them I had personal conversations with. I'm like, no, this is going too far, too expansive, too quick.
This was supposed to end on a happier note.
So I will say is I think that history,
I think that history
is gonna help the next generation not repeat the mistakes of the past. There is something very different about, we didn't rush to judgment with the insurrectionists of this last year, right? The idea that we didn't rush another Patriot Act following the insurrection. I totally take your point, Amy and Secretary Napolitano, Janet, that does mean that the Biden administration understood that that's not what they needed or wanted, and they didn't ask for it. So that's a sign of success. I think the fact that there's a kind of a very vibrant civil society, and look, I teared up, in a positive, happy way. I know this sounds so crazy, but I'm a bit that way. When I was taking down my Christmas tree on January 27th, literally a month after the holiday, because I didn't have time to do it beforehand. And that was the day after the president had signed the executive order on the Muslim ban. And I'm taking down the ornaments that had dust accumulated on them because, they've been there for over a month. And when I saw people rush to the airports spontaneously, no one told them to go there. We didn't tell them to go there. No one told. People just spontaneously got into Ubers and cars and cabs, went to airports. And when you saw the sign saying, "We are all Muslims," I thought we're going to be okay, even with Donald Trump as president. God damn,
progress.
We're going to be okay. And I teared up, and I still feel like that's the arc of change, and we're not there yet. And I know that I'm not being, I don't want to be overly optimistic, but we'll be okay. We'll ask these hard questions, and we'll engage the way we need to, and we'll be totally fine if we ask these questions.
Secretary Napolitano, could I just give you a last word here, and Professor Ziegart too? Something hopeful.
I'm going to agree with Anthony. And we can and we must do better. But if we have the joint commitment to do better, we will. I mean, American history is full of ups and downs and twists and curves, but it does move forward.
And Professor Ziegart, Amy?
So turning back to students, I think what always makes me feel most optimistic is teaching students in the classroom. They're idealistic, they're smart, they're eager to learn. They don't take history as destiny. And they're open to crossing bridges that we might never think about. So one of the programs I lead at Hoover pairs military fellows and diplomats with current Stanford undergraduates. And the one requirement for our Stanford students is they have to have no prior exposure to the military or the State Department before. So you can't preach to the choir. You have to be building bridges to different communities. And so that's been an eye-opening experience for everyone. The students showed our military fellows last year that climate change was a much higher on their priority list than the fellows might have thought. And the students learned a lot from the fellows about what it was like to be them and to have to deploy to Afghanistan and Iraq and elsewhere. So whenever I get pessimistic, I just turn to undergraduates, and they're amazing with their optimism and their capabilities.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. And thanks to all of you so much for a conversation that was uncongenial, but still was able to get points across. And I think that's an important way for people to see us talking about these different point of views, to be civil, even if you disagree. I think we did that quite well. And thank you also to the Commonwealth Club who hosted today's event. The club is going to be posting this video along with other relevant programs on its website, www.commonwealthclub.org. And thank you so much for being with us today. I'm Dina Temple-Raston, and this concludes our special virtual program at the Commonwealth Club.